Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Board of Adjustments meeting for the City of Moscow for Thursday, March 23rd. And with that, we have two things on the agenda tonight. So, I guess, first things first, I'd like to welcome our new board member. Steve Bush is our latest addition to the board. Welcome. Thank you. We have minutes to approve. Before someone makes a motion on this half a page worth of minutes, I did notice one scrivener on the paragraph that starts long moved. Right in the middle, it says they used. That used should be used to. I think it's just a wrong verb tense. But aside from that, anybody else have any comments on the minutes? Excuse me. Seeing that no one has any comments on the minutes, does anybody want to make a motion?
Sure, move to approve as corrected. If I don't see the correction. I don't either. I think it says what you think it says. What you want it to say.
Were they used to change tires?
Well, what?
It should say use to.
Used to.
I don't think
Used.
so.
Used.
I think past tense fine there.
I think that's correct.
You could say they formerly changed. Formerly changed tires.
Yeah, I don't see any.
About the change of how gas lease service stations
Yeah, so it's
definitions changed over time.
Is that the correct tense? Okay.
yes.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
how you do it.
Well, then I retract that correction. My English is bad.
So move approval.
We have a motion?
So moved.
Have a second? All in
Second.
favor?
Aye.
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 I'll abstain since I wasn't here.
Okay. Motion. Mark.
Lorraine was
Abstained.
Lori moved. right?
Yes.
No, I heard.
I moved
I heard Jerry move.
and Jerry seconded.
Either one.
I've got
Whatever.
Jerry as the move and Lorraine as the second. Without my correction. We good? Okay.
Do we need?
All right. Let's move on to the, well, let's see, we need to move the approval of the relevant criteria as well. I didn't see that on the,
No, we did that at
Did
that
that-
meeting. That's what we did at that meeting.
okay.
It was probably a 5-minute meeting, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
That was all part of it.
17 minutes.
How long was it?
Yeah. A whopping 17 minutes.
17.
Anyway, let's move on to the public hearing for LUP 2017-0002.
Good evening, board members and members of the public. I'm Ryan Cash, Community Development Staff and City Liaison. On behalf of this Board of Adjustments meeting, I thank you for coming out to these two conditional use permit applications. The first conditional use application is for Farm Road Apartments located at 210 Farm Road. And the proposal is the applicant is proposing to construct a 48-unit, 3-story apartment complex at 210 Farm Road in the city of Moscow within the Motor Business Zoning District. Residential uses are permitted by right within the Motor Business Zone, and as Moscow City Code states, residential uses include residential rental units, provided that any dwelling located on the ground floor shall be located behind commercial uses in a manner that will not interrupt commercial frontage. Conditional use for this permit is residential uses including residential rental units located on the ground floor which are not located behind commercial uses or otherwise authorized therein. Therefore, conditional use permit is required for the 5 total dwelling units on the ground floor directly adjacent to Farm Road. Operational characteristics: the apartment complex would provide a total of 12 one-bedroom units, 36 two-bedroom units, 78 parking stalls, ADA parking and curb cutouts, trash enclosures, a mailbox bank, and provide fire truck access. No commercial use is intended for this subject property. So looking at our street view, we can see the direction of the property to the northeast, and you can see the expanse going all the way to the top of the hill as indicated in your packets for the overall property line. and sweeping next to the shared driveway all the way to the formerly University 4 theaters. Here's an aerial shot of the subject property as it pertains to the local development within this area. A little bit of background about this property. The 67,998 square foot subject property is a vacant lot with Latah County Farm Bureau and Carrynet of the Palouse abutting the northern property line. The University of Idaho dairy property lies west of the farm road, with Winco Foods and Palouse Mall to the southwest of the subject property. A vacant movie theater, formerly University 4 theaters, abuts the southern property line, and to the east of the subject property line, there are multiple three-story buildings currently owned by Bloom Apartments. So here's our site plan of the subject property. As you can see, the conditional use permit is for these 5 units that are abutting Farm Road. Everything else within the inside of the property, as well as the inside access aisles, are by right permitted through a motor business. Here's some elevations showing the architecture of the local property of the proposed units and the individual floor plans for both the 1 and 2 bedroom units. Taking a look at the zoning, the minimum lot requirements for residential uses within the motor business zone include 5,000 square foot minimums for lot areas or 800 square feet per dwelling unit, and the minimum lot width is 50 feet. The subject property meets all minimum standards with a lot area of 67,998 square feet. Looking at the local zoning in the general vicinity of the area, as you can see, the subject property is highlighted in red. To the northwest, we have motor business slated around the university properties, which is currently undeveloped. And again, we can see with everything on the eastern parcel line westward is motor business. Directly abutting the subject property's far east parcel line is R4 with the Bloom Apartments, and then again motor business down in the southeast area along Baker Street. So the intent of motor business zoning is to provide for the location and grouping of compatible uses having similar operation, as they involve enterprises which depend primarily on the transient motor vehicle-based trade. Permitted principal uses and structures. Residential units, including residential rental units, provided that any dwelling units on the ground floor shall be located behind commercial uses in a manner that will not interrupt commercial frontage, except as otherwise authorized herein. Residential uses may be allowed on the ground floor on a secondary street frontage of corner lots. Conditional uses, again, as stated, is the residential uses including residential rental units located on the ground floor, which are not located behind commercial uses or otherwise authorized herein. And just taking a look at the access, we have the primary and secondary access on the proposed development. Primary access is coming off of Farm Road. The subject property has over 300 linear feet of commercial frontage from Farm Road, which vehicular access by way of 2 shared existing vehicular easement points. Again, primary access is from Farm Road, which is a 24-foot wide vehicle apron, and the overall length from the intersection of Farm Road to the parcel line there is 208 feet. Secondary access is from westbound A Street, which is a 20-foot apron, and the access point from the intersection of A into the subject property is 211 feet long. Here we have some easements. There's utility and drainage easements.
Ryan, is it okay if I ask a question now? Or would you rather finish?
I can answer a
It's
question.
about this one.
Sure.
So what's the nature of both of those easements? Because the one from the north obviously is crossing 2 separate properties, and then the one from the west is shared. Like, are those public easements?
Correct. The intention of these particular easements is that it was developed in the way where they would provide parking and driveway access in between all 3 subject properties.
Okay, so that included this property when the easements were created.
That is correct.
Okay.
And as we see here, we have some easements on the site. The existing yellow box exemplifies the existing U of I overhead utility easement. The subject property currently has overhead utilities that parallel Farm Road that are owned by University of Idaho, which is atypical. Typically, Avista owns these aerial rights. This particular parcel is dedicated to, or this additional easement anyway, is dedicated to the University of Idaho. The applicant proposes to have the utility right-of-way and overhead power lines relocated to the west side of Farm Road, which is indicated in the pink. And there also is a secondary course of action would be moving the utilities underground, relocated if it's unsustainable. But there's also a drainage easement parallel to the east side of Farm Road, where the applicant is identifying that the location as a potential retention pond. Easements to the east side of the property. As you can see, the yellow indicated again shows the overhead easements on site. Those are actually owned by Avista. They will remain untouched during this development process. And the utility easement for the relocation would be basically coordinated with the Public Works Department at the time of plan review. The overhead utility, as indicated, will not be altered or interfered with on the east side. And there's also, because of the separation of boundaries from a motor business to an R4 residential district, we have a 14-foot type B landscape buffer required between the eastern parcel line and the multifamily residential. Departmental feedback, there was no comments from any departments or entities pertinent to the CUP process. Considerations, again, the University of Idaho overhead utility easement and power line relocation are to be coordinated with the Public Works Department at the time of plan review. The stormwater easements are to be coordinated with the Public Works Department at the time of plan review. And all parking must conform to the City of Moscow's off-street parking requirements per Moscow City Code, which, based off of the preliminary plan reviews, as the applicant had submitted them, it exceeds those parking standards. And again, that 14-foot type B landscape buffer between the eastern parcel line to separate the motor business and multifamily residential zoning districts. Community Development staff recommends approval for the application for a conditional use permit at 210 Farm Road for a multifamily apartment complex within the motor business zoning district with residential units on the ground floor with no conditions. At this point, I'd like to entertain any kind of questions you might have for me.
I have a few more, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
Start. I don't know if you have a photo. So the eastern boundary, the part that borders the multifamily district, so there's a hill there?
Correct.
And does the Plus Care property have the landscape buffer behind the building there?
That I don't know the situation.
There is one
They've
there?
got a retaining wall, and then they have the landscape buffer in that direct backyard there to the east.
Okay, so there's enough space there for a 14-foot buffer and a retaining wall?
Yeah, you can reduce that to 10 feet if you provide irrigation, so that's what the CareNet property's done in the past to satisfy that.
Okay. Because I was just trying to imagine the retaining wall plus the buffer fitting in that space. All right.
That was actually part of my question. So really, that buffer really only applies to that southeastern edge,
Correct.
right? Not
Just that-
between it and the farm. Is that not the Farm Bureau, but the other?
Correct.
Right there. There's no buffer there where you're.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, this is part of that shared driveway.
Okay.
And so the only thing that would be required of the buffer would be on this eastern parcel, that little bit right there.
Well, I guess I did have another question I forgot about. Assuming just signage, but there'll be some mechanism to inform the residents they can't use the parking in those other two businesses?
The parking situation on this lot, I believe, because it has the shared access. Whoops, I just list that real quick. Let me go back there. So the required parking, they're by right indicating the total parking count for this area right here. They have a shared access right there. The adjacent properties, they may have an option to indicate their own private parking, but they wouldn't be required, and it's not expected of the tenant to provide signage for those particular lots.
I mean, that is a potential concern, that the tenants would end up parking across the shared access there. 'Cause on both sides, on the care side and on the Farm Bureau side, since they're directly across from. I don't know if that's something we would want to condition, but it is a potential problem.
I have a question regarding the whole southern line. Does that new parking become an adjacent asphalt surface with the University Theater asphalt? Because that then creates kind of another vehicular means of travel through
Correct.
that space.
During
Is there a separation between those two?
There is. During the preliminary plan review, they indicated the separation. They wanted to actually explore a southern access point to that and work out an agreement with University for. It became, it was deemed overly difficult to try to obtain. So they've got a delineation with a curb essentially that's going to separate the different property lines.
Okay, so then, in essence, there won't be any vehicular access across that southern property.
Correct.
Okay.
To directly address that issue. That's correct, Joel.
This is really just a technical question about the application itself and not about the parking or the property lines, which is that looking at number 1 on the application, it identifies DK Mullen Architects as the applicant, and then relationship to affected property, they checked purchaser. And from what I read in the remainder of the document, they were operating as the agent of the purchaser, and so it should have been identified as other. Maybe, I'd like to see that corrected, possibly.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, can we give a handout as an adjacent property owner?
Actually, we're gonna finish this. The way this will work, we'll address questions with the city, and then we'll open it up to public commentary. And at that point, you're welcome to do that. Any more questions for the city? Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, would the owner or owner's applicant or representative care to come up and explain this project to us?
Okay, my name is Matt Edwards. I work with DK Mullen Architects as a project manager.
And we state your residence address for the record also.
DK Mullen's resident?
No, yours.
Oh, my resident address is 228 North Asbury Street here in Moscow. And again, I'm here on behalf of DK Mullen Architects and therefore on behalf of our client in regards to this project. And I guess I think the project was fairly well described here already, but simply, yes, it's a 48-unit, 3-story apartment complex building that our client is interested in developing at this site. And the, again, primary reason for this process that we're going through now here is the question of not including the commercial aspect of the frontage on Farm Road. And I guess I can answer any questions you may have. But
I've got two.
Okay.
Was there an intentional intent by the applicant not to provide commercial along that frontage? Is there?
Yes. So we did, in early discussions with our client, talk about the possibility of incorporating a commercial aspect to the project on that side of the site. But in discussions with him, he did not necessarily believe that a commercial component would benefit the development of this site in the aspect that, at least as it currently stands, Farm Road is not particularly a main drive. There's not a lot of necessarily commercially driven traffic on that road as it stands. And there's also, with the adjacencies of the mall complex, there's quite a bit of commercial availability directly adjacent to the site. And so he believed that maximizing the potential of residential units in the project would be more beneficial, obviously from in his regard, as an aspect of renting as many units as possible out, but also in regards to he is an alumni of the University of Idaho, and his interest in this project as well is to, in a sense, give back to the community. And it's been noted that there is a deficiency of multifamily residential unit availability. And so by maximizing the potential for residential units, he believes that it's going to be the best way to move forward with this project.
Okay. My second question, I'm going to ask you, because you might know, I actually meant to ask the city. If you don't know, I'll ask them. But
Sure.
There was mention that there was room for more parking stalls than what was required. Do you know offhand what the number of rooms ratio to what was driven?
Yes. So the preliminary calculations are provided on the C 1.0 drawing sheet that was provided. And so that discusses the required parking calculations. So the required parking for the one-bedroom units would be 1.25 parking stalls per unit, and the two-bedroom units would be 1.75. So calculating that out for the complex, that's where we arrive at 78 required parking stalls for the complex. And we are currently providing 83. And there are still some considerations to be explored as far as the site plan. As mentioned, the landscape buffer. We're working with parametrics out of Pullman for the civil engineering and landscaping design for this project. And so we are exploring right now the possibilities of if we need to extend a retaining wall in that back corner of the site, or if that can potentially be graded enough to not need the retaining wall. But that could subject a couple of those parking stalls to being removed if we can't make everything fit in that back corner.
And in your plan here, these numbers with the circles, that's the number of stalls per that bank.
Specific aisle or area, yes.
Okay. I'm curious whether your client ever tried to pursue a rezone of this to R3 rather than working with the conditional use in motor business. I'm asking this because I've lived here for 14 years, and there has been no successful attempt to put commercial space along that road for most of that 14 years. The university cinemas has been vacant. At one point, I talked to someone who was interested in putting a different sort of business in there. That didn't go anyplace. There's quite a bit of vacant space within the Palouse Mall on a consistent basis right now. And so, I agree with turning it into a housing area, but I'm just wondering what the utility of even retaining it as motor business is anymore.
Sure. I can say that in regards to my experience with the project, that has not come up as a component of the discussion as far as rezoning. I couldn't speak to quite the process of that, but perhaps Ryan might be able to, or Mike, yeah.
Well, a rezone process would typically take about 3 to 4 months, and it'd probably take a comp plan amendment that would be associated with this. A conditional use permit is 3 to 4 weeks, so there is a time, and they can pretty much do what they would be able to do within a R4 rezone just through going through the conditional use permit for those ground floor commercial, waiver to residential. So that's why they would take this route.
Thank you.
And there is a certain time sensitivity to the project, which is one of the items that we've discussed previously with the building department. Our client's goal would be to start construction late summer of this year. So a 3 to 4 month rezoning process could impact that goal.
Any other questions for that applicant? Thank you.
Sure, of course. Thank you.
Now I would like to invite anybody that would like to come up and speak in favor of this application. Please come up and state your name and address for the record.
Justin Rasmussen, 1435 Bora Avenue, and I'm actually the broker that's facilitating the transaction. And to speak to the desire for commercial on the ground floor, I think Lorraine's right. The demand has not been there. Having been one of the main sources that's worked with businesses coming into the area and looking at this site, it's just not been something that they've been interested in doing. First of all, it's the secondary relation that it has behind the theater off of the Pullman Highway is something that most commercial retail businesses and or office businesses actually that we've worked with recently have just not found appealing in any way. We have looked at a series of offers over the last several years from different groups. This is by far the best project that's been put forward. Just in terms of the highest use for this piece of ground, I really do feel like this is the highest use possible for this at the current time. And so I would encourage you to pass it based on that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else care to come up and speak in favor of this application? Seeing none, would anybody care to come up and speak against this application?
Would you guys be willing for a handout, just so you can kind of see what we're doing, or not?
Sure.
Whether hand that out, I'm Tom Chamberlain, and I'm the president of the board of directors for Latah County Farm Bureau, which owns the property at 220 Farm Road, and I currently live in Troy, Idaho. We have a couple of concerns with this, and one of them is the shared access, because when we purchased this property, the shared access was for another business. They're not rezoning it to be an apartment complex with an increased amount of traffic flow through that lot, because it was motor business, and it was what it currently is now. So with that increased traffic flow, it's really going to hamper business to both CareNet and to Farm Bureau. I don't know where there's another business in the city of Moscow that has an entire residence complex behind it that uses the same entrance to get to that. So as you can see up there at the top, I got a couple of bulleted points. So the increased traffic, the number of parking spaces, and it talks a little bit about it down here below, but the 79 proposed parking spaces that they got, if you calculate that out into residents and how many people typically live in a house, the 1.25 and the 1.75 to get that exact balance, go by any of the other apartment complexes in town and see if they're not parking out on the street and if every parking spot is full. So how do we as a business, or CareNet as a business, police that? You know, now we have to intense responsibility of going out there and having them towed if they park on the wrong side of the parking spot. You know, we can make sure the residents are aware of that, but what happens about the people that come and visit them? You know, their friends, or maybe it's the delivery man that comes by and he parks in the wrong spot. So, and as the owners of the property for Farm Bureau, we are Farm Bureau. Part of the Latah County Farm Bureau owns the building, and we are just the leaseors that lease that to Idaho Farm Bureau Insurance out of Pocatello. So if we have this increased traffic flow and we end up losing our tenant, that could be a substantial financial problem for us as well. I'm not real good at this. This is my first time I've ever been here, so bear with me on the nervousness of it. He's been talking a lot up front here, I can tell. So I don't know. Does anybody have any questions for what I've presented? Or
I have a question for you. In terms, I actually drive by that corner multiple times a day. How full does the parking lot get between those two businesses now during the daytime? Because I kind of go there on my way to and from work, and at that point in time, the lot's not full. But I'm assuming during the course of a business day, can you give me an idea how many stalls get used there?
Can some of you guys help me answer that? Because I don't go by there all the time during the day either.
Can I speak for CareNet in response to that?
Sure, but before you make your comments, we need to have them part of the record. So I'll let you answer that question for us here in just a second. Are there any more questions for this gentleman?
So basically, when I've been there, there's been 4 to 5 cars in the Farm Bureau parking lot. Sometimes you'll have a couple of clients there at once, and you'll have 7 or 8. But typically, that's what I've been seeing as through there, and that's on the up side of that north arrow, and then there's 2 spots up top by CareNet that are shared back and forth.
I do have a question. So how you characterize your understanding of the easement, is that just what you expected, or do you know what the easement says?
I do not know what the easement says. Do you happen to know what the easement actually says?
That's why I'm asking about it.
I just wanted to question the assumption you make about how many cars would be needed for the tenant mass of this complex, because these are primarily going to be students who are using this area. One of the advantages of this location is it's in rather close walking distance to both the university campus and to shopping at the shopping center. And so I don't know that I agree that every single person residing in that complex will need to have a car. And as a student, a lot of them will not be able to afford to have a car, but will choose to live here so that they can be a cyclist and a pedestrian easily in Moscow.
But many of those people will drive a car to school and then park it for months on end. I remember getting notices to have my car towed because I hadn't drove it in so long when I was in school here.
No.
There's also a tremendous amount of traffic that goes by there. We're talking about how somebody was saying there's not a lot of traffic that goes by there, and that makes it not very suitable for business. But according to our calculations, there's about 360 cars per hour that use that A Street Farm Road corner there going by there. So that is a significant amount of traffic. You figure that over an 8 or a 10-hour day. It's about 6 cars every minute averaging from that 8 to 5 time period. So, and that's not counting the commuter traffic first thing morning and night. So.
Any other question?
Just to reiterate, we're just concerned about all this extra traffic going to and from these apartment complexes going through the CareNet Farm Bureau shared easement and that we share there, and then the one that's shared with the undeveloped property to the south. Because when we bought that property, we were figuring that was motor business zoned, and we weren't anticipating having a tremendous amount of residential traffic come through the same parking lot, instead of the occasional coming and going of a person, and are concerned why there isn't with this proposal, why there is not a third entrance coming off of Farm Road to access it in that southwest corner down there where the settling pond is there, or gathering pond. I know you still are required to have that pond there, so it would require leaving one of the structures off, is the way I see it.
Any more questions?
Okay, thank you for your time.
Your turn. Please step up to the mic so that and state your name and address for the record.
Hi, I'm Michelle Ellenwood. My address is 1003 Grandford Drive, and I am the CEO of Police Care Network, one of the adjoining properties. I just want to start by saying that in general, we are not opposed to the building of the apartment complex, but we do have concerns. We do take issue with several points and wonder if some conditions need to be made or changes need to be made, many of which we share, concerns we share with Farm Bureau, specifically related to the operating characteristics they list. We realize they do meet the parking requirements to have those spaces available, but we also agree with Farm Bureau that it is very likely that parking will encroach on our available parking during our business hours. We don't see any way that isn't possible. And in terms of our parking spaces, there are times when we have multiple spaces available, but there are days on our busier days where we actually have to ask our employees to park elsewhere just to have spaces for our clients already. And so if we already are having our employees walk a block over to work to leave spaces for clients, then there really is no room for even a few college students to come and inadvertently park in our parking spaces, and we have no way to contact them and have them move those. Additionally, on the site map, we understand there's a buffer between the residential area in the back, but from what we can see, there would be no real buffer between that actual property, the apartment complex itself, and our business. So, like, for instance, those dumpsters are directly across from our front door. There's no way that is not going to be just unsightly and a nuisance. Secondly, we disagree with the idea that this is in harmony with existing residential use, mostly because of that buffer, also because there's no unique access to this property, as we heard from Farm Bureau. So that's really our biggest concern, that these are shared access. We totally understand that, and again, we're not even opposed to the building, but every bit of their traffic is going to come directly past the front door of our organization. There's no way around that from both access points. And it seems unreasonable that based on the way that property is laid out, none of the traffic moves through their property. It all moves past our organization and behind their apartments. So we really bear the total brunt of all the traffic that will be produced as a result of this 80-room, I guess, approximately, apartment complex. Also, they mentioned that it would not be a nuisance to us based on the hours of operation and the hours that the traffic would be there. We disagree with that as well, because we open at 10 o'clock for clients. We have staff there additional hours for other things, but we open at 10 o'clock for clients. That's going to be the primary time that college students are going to be, as we all know, college students are rushing away from their dorms to try to get to college on time. And then they will be coming back in mid to late afternoon, which is our high traffic time for clients. And additionally, because of the nature of our services, we have parenting classes, all types of parenting classes, and classes we serve primarily single moms, low-income families, lots of small children that access on this end of the building, the south end of the building, I guess. And that's where they all come in and out for the parenting classes, where that classroom is. And we feel like that traffic that's all going to be produced straight past that front door, right where that parking lot we will share at the end, we think that is a safety issue as well, potentially, especially since, and I'm not anti-college students, that's primarily who we serve, but we do know that they are prone to drive fast and be distracted. So it seems like funneling every bit of that traffic past our business and really us bearing the brunt of all of that, it seems unreasonable, and it seems like that could be solved if there was just an additional access point from Farm Road, rather than, we're fine with sharing those access points, but we have no choice. But it seems like there should be a third access point from Farm Road. I think that's it.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Clearly the two businesses have trash pickup now. Where does that trash pickup occur for your business and Farm Bureau?
So we, I don't actually know where, I don't ever do the trash, clearly. Oops. I'm not sure where the actual trash cans are picked up. I guess I can't ask.
Farm Bureau's trash is picked up right at the entrance off of Farm Road. You can see there's a square there.
So I guess we roll it out.
M and primary, right there.
My guess is that we would roll ours to the same place. But
Yeah, I believe CareNet keeps theirs on the southern end of the property and rolls it out towards the street, and they pick it up along A Street, I believe, was their original plan.
And we just have two small trash cans. So the additional entryway would be our recommendation, as well as some wall or buffer on that back corner of the complex in order to slow down foot traffic, I guess, and just unsightliness in general.
Any questions for her? Thank you. Would anybody else care to get up and speak on this?
Mr. Chairman, members of the council, Bob Smathers, 238 Pintail Lane. I would just like to say that I go in and out of that lot quite a bit, and I have a trailer that I park there. It's very difficult for me to take a right turn onto, or a left turn onto Farm Road, or a right turn onto A Street just because of the amount of traffic there, and it is pretty substantial. I've had people honk at me when I'm taking a right turn onto A Street. I look and there's nobody coming, and I pull out there and there's somebody right on my tail. There are farmers and ranchers that come into the Farm Bureau office that haul trailers in there. Now, we're going to lose a place for them to even put their trailers now that we have those parking lots on the south end now. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but it is an issue trying to get in and out of there. So I do think another entrance is important there. Another issue that's been pointed out is snow removal. They have an issue with that. They wouldn't have an issue with that now because they can push it out in the field, but where do they put it? I don't know. That's just something that hasn't really been talked about here. So,
I do have a question. Sir, you mentioned trailers. Are the trailers right now having to park across the property line onto that?
No. I park it in a parking space right over next to the trash there on the west end of the parking lot.
Yeah, I see it.
So,
Thank you. Would anybody else care to come up and speak about this application? Seeing none, feel free, come back up, state your name and address again.
Tom Chamberlain, Troy, Idaho. Do you need to know the address? 4201 Highway 8.
Okay.
I wrote it in the thing that I handed out, but we were concerned about the snow removal. I did forget that point, but think of how many parking spaces that does take up if you just got to push it into a dead hole back there. So if Caranet has to push it into one of their parking spots, we have to push it into a couple of our parking spots, then our lots are extremely full already, and then they're going to have to push all that snow back in there and put it and potentially block that pond, and they got to have that access for the fire truck or emergency services personnel to be able to turn around as well. So there's going to be a tremendous problem if we have another year of snow like we did right this last year or so.
Do they push the snow across the property line right now? Is that how you get rid of it?
Currently, yeah, it's being pushed on the edge of the asphalt there.
Okay, so
Thank you.
Please come up and state your name and address again so that we know who's on the record.
Justin Rasmussen, 1435 Bora Avenue. I think one piece that's important to consider with this piece of ground is kind of the history of it and the way that it was developed. It was all originally one piece. And at the time, it was thought that it would be more appealing if it were subdivided into separate lots. So that was the way it went. One of the major concerns was access for the piece now that we're currently discussing, and that's where it came to working out these easements that now are creating kind of this traffic problem. So part of the workaround was that when it came to this point and this piece was to be developed, that these easements would allow us to work with the neighbors to come to a solution that would work for everyone. Part of the challenge is that the price for this piece precludes smaller developments. So one of the major reasons this hasn't sold in the past has to do with its cost. It's got a high price tag on it. And therefore, in order to make a project work, a developer has to come in and either do a project similar to this or something large in scale. And the scale of the project is going to create traffic issues down the road, no matter if it's this project, the next project, whatever it is. The nature of these access agreements and the size of the project that needs to go in here to make this feasible are going to create these issues. So I would really encourage, if we need to come up with some compromises, some ways to make this work, we find those, because it's a bridge we're going to have to cross down the road no matter what happens, unless we just leave this a vacant piece of ground, which I don't think it really benefits the business or any of the adjacent businesses as well. So I would really encourage us to find some proactive solutions here, being that this is a bridge we're going to eventually cross at some point.
Sure. So a couple of questions for you. Do you think it's possible to obtain an agreement with the property to the south?
Not currently. That's an avenue that we've pursued very actively for quite a long time. Unless the property management changes there, that's not something that's going to happen in the near term. It has much more to do with the group that represents the property than the owners there.
Okay. And then it sounds like you were involved, at least to some extent, in...
I wasn't initially. I've done a lot of research in taking on the property and looking at it. Yeah. So
Can
I
you
understand the history of it.
describe in any detail the nature of either if they're just access agreements or if they're easements or if the type of use that was described in those for this
and
remaining
Mike
parcel?
may be able to speak to this more clearly than I can.
Yeah, and I processed the lot divisions on this piece of property, so we had the copies of the easements at the time. They're cross-access easements, has no, it doesn't specify uses on those properties. It's just a standard cross-access easement. When they did this, you have two arterial streets. So you've got Farm Road and you've got A Street. So anytime the city has any type of development on properties that are adjacent to collectors or arterials, we try to limit the number of approaches as much as possible, because you have a curve to Farm Road here as you're heading to the northeast there. And so that's really why they had done this master plan and had the two cross-access easements. And then you notice the detention pond there in the corner. Well, that actually also takes the stormwater from CareNet and Farm Bureau and has master planned that to detain all the water that's currently coming off of all the properties on that site.
And so the drainage easement that parallels Farm Road, that the dominant estate, that benefits the two parcels to the north. That's the purpose of that easement.
That's a franchise utility easement, I believe.
The drainage easement? Isn't there a drainage easement paralleling Farm Road?
Yeah.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a franchise and a drainage. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, I would just really encourage that we find a proactive solution for this, because this is going to be an issue no matter who or what the development is to come on this property. It's definitely going to be traffic related, and with these shared access easements, it's going to be a bridge we're going to have to cross. So I would just say let's find a way to cross that now and move the project forward.
Yeah, can I just responding to you, something that as I've been listening to the people speaking against this, they really came. This is a very awkward corner in our city, and I think placing those two access easements made a lot of sense, but some of the problems that are being discussed existed in that neighborhood before either Farm Bureau or CareNet put their buildings there. The street has been a kind of a feeder street for a long time. People do come whizzing along it. They have, and it's a fairly blind corner, and so I think, and yeah, there are a lot of apartment houses that apparently don't have enough parking, and so there are spillover issues. But I don't see that those issues really relate to our conditional use permit application, because those are problems that have existed for these businesses in that site all along.
Thank you. Would anybody else care to come up and speak against it? Mr. Smathers, please step back up.
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I'm not against it. I just think there's an access issue here. It just seems to me like there should be something on the south side of the development. And I'm curious, this is just a question I have, is there a situation in Moscow where we have shared accesses through motor business into a complex like this? I'm just curious. I don't know. I can't think of one, but I'm just curious if there is one.
Mike, are you aware of any?
That have residential and commercial on the same lot.
It sounds to me like this was created for this particular parcel because of its different nature. Seems like this is a unique condition.
What about Left Schwab? The Left Schwab subdivision behind the Left Schwab building, they use that same shared driveway going through Left Schwab to get to that parking space behind for those apartments.
Yeah, that would be one that I could think of. Sure.
Did you want to make one more comment? Please state your name again.
Tom Chamberlain, Troy, Idaho. I just want to go on the record as saying we're not against this whole project. We just think that we need to work together to find a solution so not all that traffic comes through all those two entrances they are right now, because it was originally zoned as motor, I lost the term now, motor business, and now we're trying to reclass it as R2. And when we purchased the property, we were expecting it to be another business. Yes.
Well, just a point of clarity, this isn't a rezone, so it's just a conditional use permit.
Okay.
So the property's still motor business, and we're really just talking about the 5 units on the ground floor that are directly adjacent to Farm Road. So they could put commercial units in those, which would require probably more parking than residential units, and they could put all the additional apartments that you see on the screen, which would have, and they could do that by right, and they wouldn't have to go through a conditional use permit. Really, we're just talking about those 5 units directly adjacent to Farm Road on the ground floor is what we're here to discuss tonight.
Right, and I appreciate that. And I understood that. I just lost focus on that.
Oh, sure.
But so that's all we are. And as far as the drainage water, we also understood that when this plot was subdivided when Karanet and us purchased at different times, that we knew that water was already planned ahead to go through there. So I'm going back and looking at leaving that pond there is going to continue to benefit us. It was the original part of the plan when we purchased those lots originally. So I just want to go on the record and say is we're not against the project. I think we just need to work together to come up with a solution for the traffic and parking.
With that said, would the applicant like to come up and respond to one final time with some of the concerns that have been brought up?
Yes. So again, my name's Matt Edwards. I'm at 228 North Asbury Street here in Moscow. And I would just like to, to further the clarification of the discussion that I think the vast majority, if not all of the issues that have been brought up for discussion are issues that would remain regardless, based on the fact that the CUP application is considering the non-inclusion of a commercial aspect to this site, whereas if our client was to have to include a commercial aspect to the site, we would still be looking at a fairly large number of residential units in addition to a commercial aspect to that site, which, if anything, I believe would perhaps even compound some of these concerns of shared access aisle, easements, snow removal, et cetera, et cetera. And we have also gone through a number of site plan iterations and explorations with this project, trying to meet the concerns of access aisles, meet the concerns of maximizing the number of units on the site, meet concerns of parking. Obviously, our client is definitely concerned about the parking on the site and has made efforts in our discussions and explorations of this site plan to maximize the parking, not only to the benefit of the people that would be living in the complex, but also to the benefit of the surrounding businesses, to try to ensure as much as possible that there is enough parking provided for the people that would be utilizing the living spaces. And so I guess as just a final note, and as it's already been mentioned, I think that the nature of this project, the nature of the property is a unique piece of property. The scale of the property does, I think, necessitate a scale of project similar to this. And as has already been mentioned, these kind of issues would inevitably arise with, I think, the majority of projects that would be looked at on this site. And our client definitely has the interest to try to meet everybody's concerns, but our primary concern here is seeking approval for not including a commercial aspect on Farm Road, which I think is the focus of this meeting. So that's what I wanted to say in closing.
Thank you. With that, I'm closing the public hearing so that the board can deliberate amongst ourselves. Who'd like to start? Before we do, one point of clarification. My understanding, as I've driven on this road before, there is no off-street parking allowed. There's no parking on farm or a street, is there?
No, there's not.
Okay. The other thing, and Mike brought this up too, the residents, all of them except the 5 up front facing farm,
On the bottom floor.
they can do that.
I disagree. I'll explain why, but
Okay.
it's not a big deal, but I can start.
Well, then let's start right there at that point then, because that's...
Well, I don't think it matters a whole lot, but the way that I find it, so that the permitted use is residential uses, provided that any dwellings located on the ground floor shall be located behind commercial uses. So it's only permitted if it's in fact behind a commercial use. That's a specific requirement of it. So the ones that aren't on the road, they're not behind commercial uses. So I don't think it's not a big deal, but I want to be clear about that. If there's going to be ones on the ground floor, on the roadside, they have to be behind commercial uses. That's what the code requires for permitted use. But the purpose of that, continuing along there, in a manner that will not interrupt commercial frontage. And so the purpose of the requirement is to maintain that kind of commercial feel to the motor business district, recognizing that won't always be applicable. That's why we have the conditional use. That's why we're here. And this is,
Yeah, but it says any dwelling units located on the ground floor should be located behind commercial uses.
Right.
But allows for residential above.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. But since we don't have,
Sure.
you can't have residences above without a ground floor.
Okay.
Right, so you have to start somewhere.
All right.
So we have these two situations. We have the desire to protect the commercial frontage and kind of retain the commercial district feel, and then at the same time recognizing that won't always work, that some places we will allow them on the ground floor that aren't behind commercial uses. And I think this is that type of circumstance, because we do not have a commercial district that we're trying to protect the look and feel of, and that is precisely the reason for that requirement. And so the requirement can't serve its purpose in this case. And so given that the reason for the conditional use permit, I'm not troubled by that. With respect to everything else, we're kind of, it's problematic, and I fully recognize and understand the concerns of the property owners, but that's kind of the nature, unfortunately, of these access agreements, is this parcel has a right to access the parcel for all legal uses, and all legal uses include multifamily dwellings. That is a legal use. It's allowed by the code. And there's a recognition that will have traffic. That's part of multifamily dwellings, of course. So even though those concerns exist, they are the nature of development, and it's not I don't think it's the type of thing that we can use to deny an application. It's the type of thing that we can condition and try to mitigate. But they have legal right to access that property. They have the legal right to build a multifamily dwelling. And in a lot of ways, that answers the question to me. I honestly wish it were valuable for commercial uses. It would be nice if we could have some additional commercial that was useful. I've always thought that everybody should live within a 5-minute walk of coffee, beer, and donuts. These guys happen to have that, I think. But I wish there were a way to provide access to the south. That would be the one thing I would like. But other than that, that's all I've got. Mike?
And I will just add that, in early stages of development of this project, they did come in and were wanting to have access via the University 4 theater access, but that sounds like that didn't happen when they contacted the owner to try to get a shared cross-access across that property. So, they did show kind of a good faith effort in order to try to get an access along the southern curb approach off that.
Yeah, so that's what I have.
I think requiring if we didn't approve the conditional use permit and required them to actually provide 5 or those 5 bottom areas as commercial, I think 2 things would happen. One, it would create an even bigger parking issue. And secondly, those 5 spaces would remain empty because that's just not commercial space. So I'm kind of in the same thinking as Jerry, that I don't think that's the conditional use to make to try and maintain a commercial front there that doesn't exist doesn't make sense. I think that there's the potential maybe to massage the site a little bit if there's going to be shared easement entry. I don't see any reason why there couldn't be shared garbage pickup, maybe to the same spot rather than 2 spots, one dead center. In terms of adding a condition, I don't know, since they have the legal right to use that space, making the applicant pay for signage in front of the others that state, this parking for this business only. It's gonna. I don't see how we can.
Well, we can mitigate harms, and that's a potential harm on a neighboring property owner. I mean, I think that's within our authority.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay.
We ran across this when we were talking about the development that was going to be on the west side of Rosars. Remember, it was some time ago. It was the idea that
yes,
we were doing the same exact thing.
And it didn't make sense that you put commercial on Almond because it wasn't the continuation of an exact thing. So.
Yeah. And I come back to, and I think Jerry's point is well taken. Number one, but if they decided that they were going to put commercial only on the ground floor, I don't think we're here tonight. They could do, and I think there's a problem. I'm sympathetic to the parking issue in particular, and I don't have any trouble saying, part of what needs to happen is to try to mitigate this parking with Farm Bureau and with Police Care, because this is an experience that I experience at my office, which I've got a bunch of businesses behind my office, and they run a patient care counseling, and about 4:30 every day, if I'm not there, I don't have a parking spot. And you know what? We put up the parking signs that say, park here and you're going to get towed, and they don't care, and they don't pay attention to them. So anyway, I'm all for trying to mitigate the parking, because I do see that that's going to become part of an issue, but I agree with Jerry, and I agree with you in what you said, and I think Lorraine, that's what I hear her been saying as well, and it's an odd piece of property. It just really is. And
the fact that it's taken this long for any development to go into that space that's telling. And I think that that this is the highest and best use that our market has come up with in 14 years. So we shouldn't deter it.
I think that I kind of agree with everybody. I'm concerned about the dumpster site somewhat, because I'm looking at this unit, or this application is 48 living units, and I'm familiar with a unit complex that has 24, half that, and there are 3 dumpsters for the 24, and that's not enough. And I'm looking at this dumpster site, and I only see 2 dumpsters here, and I can't say what the size are from this drawing, but 48 units, only 2 dumpster sites seems like not quite enough. But if again, we really can't make a lot of requirements in that respect, because we're not here for that, but just the property owners agreeing to put the dumpsters in a different location might be, for everybody, might be one amenable solution to the dumpster issue. And I don't think, like everybody else, I don't think that this area, which has been hard to find a home for a business, I don't think that it has a long string of business frontage there that we're going to be imposing upon if we didn't have businesses go in there on Farm Road, and it seems like the project is something that's doable for the community at this point in time. And in their application, it does say that just to the east, there is R4, and there is R4 right around the corner all the way up the hill. So it kind of matches that area of town for that type of development. And again, with being motor business, it fits the motor business need, except for the one conditional use permit here we're here talking about. And so I just don't see that it would be a stumbling block from my standpoint either.
Annette?
I have perhaps a really silly idea, but the most southern building, how the driveway to all the parking on the south end of this property, thinking that if you knocked out the two bottom units on that southern building and have it like a tunnel going and connecting to Farm Road, and I understand profitability and you'd be losing money from those bottom units, but what about that? There would be just a straightaway right there from that southern parking to Farm Road, if that's even doable. I'm no architect, so.
I thought that too. I had two comments about that. One, Mike, would they even be allowed to get a curb cut on that south side?
Well, typically you're restricted to one per property. I mean, we'd have to take a look at.
But we have three parts to one property now, so I'm wondering if a third curb cut is.
Yeah.
Well,
parcels.
it certainly the board can impose what you want to impose, but engineering, going through this lot division process, there's some reasons why they have these shared access across the properties, and that's to consolidate approaches off of arterial streets where you have curves and you have high rates of speed than what you'd normally see in a typical residential area. And so anytime you have two-way approaches where you have making left and right turns going out of those approaches, you have concerns with conflicts and potential traffic concerns on arterial streets. And so, that would be our concern, is having another approach on a higher speed roadway that could cause, additional concerns with traffic.
And it would also be almost immediately adjacent to the old theater one.
Yeah,
right?
and you have to have a certain, distance away, and so, that's really looking at spacing of approaches along Farm Road. That's why they have them separated that way.
The other comment I was going to say about that southern corner, I didn't want to put the applicant's representative on the hook yet, because I know Parametrics is working on that, but my suspicion, and maybe the engineering department has looked at this, but we're increasing the field to hardscape, and I'm suspecting that by the time Angela gets done doing what she needs to do with that lot, that swale is going to get bigger. So I would suspect that during the full design process, this building either goes away and they lose a few units, or it shrinks up, because that could very well get bigger just because it's going to.
Often what happens is it gets deeper, so they'll end up putting eco blocks
Right.
with a chain link fence on top
Please
of it.
don't. Those are so hideous. Gosh.
So that's when you don't have a very pretty small amount of space. That's typically what you do. But this one looks adequately sized in order to accommodate that. So I think the engineer that was part of the lot division process assumed future use, and so that'd be a motor business use, which would be high rates of impervious surface, and so he probably put that into the calculation and adequately sized it. I mean, and that's a really large pond right now, so I don't see that getting any bigger.
Okay.
Is there an underground pipe, stormwater pipe or something there, or is it just a swale does it just flow over the surface into it?
There's a pipe that goes to it.
The pipe is located right there. You can see the stem
okay.
right there.
At any point, will the city consider the need to make Farm and A a complete stop? Or will that always just be
Well,
continuous yield?
yeah, if you go, you have one of those.
If we're talking about speed?
Yeah, we have this whole area. So this is all university property. They have the dairy farm here. This is all master planned for motor. This is motor business as well. So this is master planned to continue A, go
Is that
around.
the subject to rezone proposal right now, or
No, it's already been rezoned.
Okay.
So it is motor business. It'll end up connecting with A Street behind Walmart over here. And so this has all been master planned for kind of large, big box retail, which would be similar to the Palouse Mall. And then this is, Farm Road's expected to continue to the northeast. And I'm sure at that point in time, they would look at it for probably signalized intersection once the A Street gets extended and Farm Road gets extended. You're likely to see probably a signalized intersection there, at least stop controlled initially, and then maybe signalized in the future, depending upon the projects that come in out there on the university property.
Joe, if you're ready, I want to ask a question, and then I'd be willing to make a motion.
Okay.
The question I want to ask is: do our traffic standards, or are there any other ways in which the city imposes calming devices within parking lots? And is that something that would be relatively easy to require in this context? Not a traffic calming speed bump. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, we don't address speed bumps in our code, and I don't know that we've ever imposed speed bumps, but the board could certainly impose speed bumps as part of this project. I don't see any reason why not.
I think I'd articulate it as like some mechanism to slow traffic, to leave the design and nature of it up to the applicant. But
I mean, that is a cross-access easement shared by both properties, and I don't know if there'd be some type of legal concern for constructing a speed bump
on the other
across
parcel.
multiple properties.
Because the three things I was thinking of, three potential conditions were to have the applicant pay for signage on the neighboring properties to inform people that they're not to be used by tenants or guests. The traffic calming feature.
Yeah, and I think we might have the same concern with signage on other property, imposing something, one applicant to
negotiate with them. I mean, it would not, they couldn't do it without the permission of the landowner. It'd be to pay for it if the neighboring landowner desires it. And I think Mark at least agrees with me that we can do that. I think we can. I think we can do that. It's really no different than impact fees or other things that we do. And the applicant suggested they're open to creative ways to deal with this. So if there were a way to do some kind of traffic calming feature, but I agree with that it's hard with the shared access. And then I agree about the dumpster being in a bad location. I don't like the idea that it's right across from a healthcare facility, but yeah.
LSI oftentimes dictates the placement of the dumpsters, and it usually revolves around easy access. So their concern would be to come all the way down into this low-lying area and have to negotiate some type of turnaround to get out of there. So it's usually, unfortunately, it's usually the easiest and closest location for them to get in and get out efficiently. And so I'd imagine that's why, after contacting LSI and working with them, I'd imagine that's probably why those dumpsters ended up in that location.
You'd still have to turn the truck around.
Yeah, I would think that's 90. Actually a difficult spot for them. The area on the back is actually set up as a hammerhead for a fire truck turnaround back there.
Well, here you could come in come down, scoop them, reverse just a little bit, and then come back out on Farm Road. Here you'd have to go down and do a full fire truck turnaround.
Yeah, it's still tighter than 90. I mean, with cars parked there. But
and I'd
LSI wants
that,
to back into the car.
And I'd imagine the angle of these are probably going to shift. I mean, you could look at requiring, if you're concerned about exposure of dumpsters to adjacent properties, I mean, you could always look at some type of screen wall, on one side to enclose the dumpster area, which they may already be planning on, but it doesn't look like it.
Okay, so admitting the traffic calming might not be, we'd advise the applicant to pursue ways to slow traffic down, but so the motion would be to approve the application as proposed with two conditions. One, that, I think about it, the applicant, if desired by the neighboring property owners, pay for signage to inform tenants and guests. They're not allowed to park there. And then second would be a barrier or screen to hide the dumpsters from the neighboring property owners. Does that seem appropriate? Assuming, okay. So that's the motion.
So there's a motion.
How are we, Ann? Did that work out? Okay.
Excuse me, just wording suggestion for the motion.
Well, you can second it and then make the suggestion. Otherwise,
Seconded?
it'll die. Yeah. Go ahead.
And yet, I think instead of desired, it would be if required or requested by the neighboring property owners. Desired doesn't they can desire it without expressing it, so we want to make sure they express the desire.
Well, we can't put an obligation on the neighboring property owners in the form of which they communicate it.
Oh, no, but I'm saying that if requested by them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Accepted.
Did you catch that, Ann? So I have a motion. I have a second. Let's go down the
I've
line.
already discussed it. Oh, you don't want to discuss the motion?
Oh,
if you
well-
object, I'm more than willing to hear other people's opinions on the motion before, or I'll vote for it right now if that's what you want to do.
Any comments on the motion? We have a motion, you have a second. I'm ready to vote if everybody else is.
Let's vote.
Aye.
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 I agree. So we have a unanimous 6, 0 nays, 0 abstentions. So the CUP is approved with those two conditions. Now we need to go through the relevant criteria.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Mike.
And you could certainly direct staff to prepare these, and then we'll come back and approve them at a later meeting date. If you have any ideas or direction to give us, we could certainly take that and try to craft our own.
Well, the question I was going to ask, so as articulated, they're just the is not, will not statements. So we're going to have the findings section, like the factual findings, and then, these are different than variances. We don't have to describe. I don't know why I can't remember how we've usually expressed these, but we can go ahead and direct staff. I can move that.
Well, there have been times when we've actually just, we like the staff's wording.
We don't have.
Yeah, we don't have that this
here.
time. We have just the applicant's wording. And
so in this case, I think the two, that number 2, number 3, are the big ones, I would imagine. Is there anything that staff would like input on if we ask you to craft them?
I think 2 and 3. 2 is fairly straightforward, being that the motor business allows residential, and there's residential in the vicinity. As far as the condition of or the criterion number 3, as far as generating nuisances, we'll probably answer that towards the mitigation factors that you've described with the park. Yeah, the 2 conditions, and so. We'll probably craft it to reflect those 2 conditions for mitigation of the nuisances.
I think in the findings section, I would express that this corridor does not have ground floor commercial.
Okay.
Because we have the hotel and then out of business movie theaters, so we don't have the ground floor commercial to protect in the motor business district. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yep. You don't have to say we don't have to protect, but just acknowledge as a factual finding that it doesn't exist in the location.
Okay.
Do we need a motion to direct staff to prepare RCS for our next meeting?
Do we? Okay. So I
Okay,
guess
so
we do.
moved.
I think we were waiting for him.
Yeah.
So we have a motion to have staff prepare criteria for us,
Consistent with our discussion.
consistent with the
tonight.
discussions. Do I have a second?
Second.
We have a motion, we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Opposed? That is a unanimous 6 ayes, 0 nays, 0 abstentions. That concludes that CUP.
Mr. Chair, do I have the floor?
Pardon me?
Do I have the floor?
Yes, you do.
Okay,
Please,
great.
please move forward, Ryan.
Okay, moving forward to our second CUP application is for Grandma Bee's Daycare at 3225 Robinson Park Road. Proposal is the applicant is proposing to operate a large daycare facility in a neighborhood business zoning district. Permittable uses within the neighborhood business zone include group daycare facilities or small daycare facilities according to Moscow City Code. And conditional uses include large daycare facilities in a neighborhood business zoning district per Moscow City Code 4-33 Delta 1. And the applicant is requesting a conditional use permit to operate a large daycare facility at 3225 Robinson Park Road. Operating characteristics, the business named Grandma Bee's Daycare is proposed to operate from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday with 4 full-time and up to 2 to 4 part-time staff depending on the child-to-staff ratio as required by state. The proposed daycare will provide curriculum and enrichment programs during the proposed operation hours for 21 or more children. Subject property, here's the street view of the subject property, our most recent photo. Previously, I've heard the comments of the Slurp and Burp, Sharman's property. Yeah, so here's the subject property in relationship to the surrounding area as an aerial shot. The subject property is highlighted in red. As you can see, it's in one of the most recent annexed areas of the city boundaries. And so it's just a little bit of background information on this particular property. It's 44,882 square foot subject property. It's the last parcel of land within Moscow city limits on the south side of Robinson Park Road. Surrounding land uses to the east are primarily agrarian in nature. To the north lies a single-family home. To the west lies Fairview Estates, which is single-family business subdivision. To the southwest lies Southgate 3rd Edition, which contains Milton Arthur Park. It's currently an undeveloped park for the city of Moscow. And the west and south lot lines to the property are currently the only other residential property within the general vicinity. So here we have the site plan of the proposed property, or the proposed daycare with the existing structures. As you can see here, they've indicated the parking stalls as required, as well as some existing ADA stalls, a tandem parking and loading zone for daycare children, as well as indicated down to the southwest, the landscape buffer. Here we have the floor plan of the existing structure. Total square footage is 3,428 feet. And a little bit about our zoning. As you can see, we have the subject property listed as in the neighborhood business. The only other surrounding zonings within the city of Moscow is R1. So the subject property is located within the neighborhood business district. The Moscow city limit boundary is located directly to the east of the subject property and also to the northwest right-of-way of the Robinson Park Road. To the southwest and south of the subject property are residential neighborhoods within low-density single-family residential R1 zoning district. Further to the west, via Robinson Park Road, lies moderate-density single-family residence R2, agricultural forest, and medium-density residential R3 zones to this section right there. So, neighborhood business zoning districts, the intent is for the neighborhood business zoning district is the lowest intensity commercial zoning district permitted within the city. It's intended to apply to areas of less than 2 acres where commercial services may be provided to community locations servicing adjoining residential neighborhoods rather than the community as a whole. The commercial services permitted are those where traffic generation access requirements, impacts of lighting, neighborhood need for services, and noise production will be the comparable with residential uses, and permitted principal uses include group daycare or small daycare facilities. Conditional uses include large daycare facilities. So here we have our access plan. It shows the traffic flow in and out of the subject property. It's functioning essentially in a roundabout way. The property has vehicular access by way of a 25-foot wide fenced and gated driveway on the north side of the property. All vehicular access will be from this point of entry. The existing ADA and 3 stalls have existing asphalt pad. The remainder of the existing parking lot is gravel. And as you can see, as indicated right there, that's where the existing asphalt pad is currently located. The owner intends to develop 2 tandem childhood loading areas at the front of the existing structure to meet the required loading requirements for daycare facilities, which are those indicated right there, and a proposed 4-foot sidewalk. Departmental feedback and Public Works said that the applicant is on city water with shared septic adjoining the property to the west. Health Department, Public Health has no objections for the proposed daycare facility, but does have concerns about hand sinks and septic systems. All healthcare related issues will be addressed at the building permit stage of the process. Considerations: all parking must conform to Moscow City's off-street parking requirements. There is a 14-foot Type B landscape buffer between the eastern parcel line to the separate neighborhood business and single-family residential zoning districts. And site-proof fencing or site-proof landscaping shall be provided on the perimeters of the outdoor play areas as necessary. The only neighbor is to the west, therefore additional fencing or landscaping beyond the required buffer is not recommended at this time. Conditional use recommendation. The community development staff recommends approval for the application of the conditional use permit at 3225 Robinson Park Road for a large daycare facility in a neighborhood business zoning district with no conditions. And I'd be happy to entertain any kind of questions you might have for me.
A couple questions.
Go ahead.
You stop there for a second.
Sure.
Is this so the structure non-conforming? Is it violating the setback on the east side there?
For that particular
Whatever
location?
the setback is, yeah.
As it stands right now, it's a current legal non-conforming since it was annexed into the city recently.
The structure is non-conforming, okay. I didn't see anything about paving the parking lot.
Correct. Since this is an existing structure, it would not need to have the paving on the particular parking lot. The only thing that would be required for the ADA access.
Yeah, but the code says that all of the requirements apply to new structures or new uses, and this is clearly a new use. And so it's required to pave the lot, right? It's a new use of an existing structure, and new uses require compliance, as you noted, with the parking requirements. And there's no distinction between the paving and the number. Those are all the parking requirements.
Correct. So the typical standard is with an existing gravel parking lot is that it has to be paved within a 5-year time frame. So with recommendation on the particular use, you are correct. I stand corrected.
Yeah, because I was going to say there's a ice rink I know that would be pretty happy to know they don't have to pave their parking lot. I mean, so that's the only concern I have. Yeah.
And what section are you referencing?
Well, it's just this. It's 6.5. Well, 465A3, application of off-street parking and loading requirements. A, new structure or use. At the time a new structure is erected or a new use is established, off-street parking shall be provided in accordance with the provisions of this section, which includes 6.5, whatever, I walked through it all, 6, areas used for parking vehicles and for maneuvering shall have plant mix asphalted concrete of 2 inches thickness with 6 inches of crushed rock base.
Yeah, we would view this as a change of use, so subsection B right below it. So typically in the past, it's been that where a change of use of the structure results in an increased requirement for parking spaces to comply with the off-street parking schedule. Such additional spaces shall be provided in accordance with the provisions of this section for vehicles or materials or for the parking of vehicles used in conducting the business of the use.
Okay, well, that's where the change in use increases the parking requirements, right? So that's the recognition that you might have an existing legitimate parking lot, and then if the change in use adds more, whatever the change is, that you then have to pave that part too. But it's clearly a new use. I mean, the top one says at the time the new use is established, this is a new use, Otherwise, we wouldn't be here.
It's a change of use.
To a new use.
A new structure, a new use. New use could be a use on a vacant piece of property that doesn't have a structure.
Yeah, but that's inconsistent with the rest of the code, which, so the code provides that all of the off-street parking requirements are a continuing obligation of the property owner, and even after you get a building permit, the continued use is subject to continued satisfaction of the requirements of the section. It's a new use. It's a new permitted use. There's no way this is not a new use.
But it was never required at the time of construction because it was in the county. So we're just inheriting this legal non-conforming use.
I understand that. But our code says when a new use is established, this is a conditional use permit. They're getting a permit for a new use. The code says pave the lot.
They're getting a permit for a change in use of an existing structure.
So A and B are different.
Uh-huh.
A tells you when the code applies, and B is when the change increases the parking requirements. It's not a provision as to when the code applies. A says new structures or new uses, the parking requirements apply. Then B says when a new use increases the number of parking over a previous use, then you have to add to the parking lot. That's what B says. And it's consistent with all the rest of them. So you read through C, D, and E, those are about how once you've already got a lot, if something changes, you have to add to the lot. But A, when a new use is established, there's no way to ignore that provision.
The previous use, prior to the daycare, what was it?
It was a community center.
An event center. Okay, so the parking
in the county
for an event center has a higher load than the parking for a daycare, correct?
Correct.
So we have a change in use, but we've actually decreased the parking requirement.
That's why we would be interpreting this as a change of use, which isn't in excess, and so they're not required to bring it up to compliance.
With the exception, wasn't there part of that in there that said, though, that specific types of parking, like the ADA parking in the unloading area, that had to be paved?
Everything has to be paved. So we can't. The change in use provision says, where a change in the use of a structure results in an increased requirement for parking spaces.
It doesn't.
No. To comply with the off-street parking schedule, such additional spaces shall be provided in accordance with the provision of this section. Paving, what have you. That is recognizing you have an existing use with an existing parking lot, and if you change the use, if that new use requires 3 more lots, you don't get to say, I already have a lot. You have to add the 3 more spaces. That's about a new use increasing the requirement for spaces, but that doesn't allow us to read out of the code the preceding section that says when a new use is established, off-street parking shall be provided in accordance with the provisions of this section, which include this whole stuff about asphalt or concrete. There's no way to read out of this a requirement they pave it. We would be, the ice rink's the best example.
Ice rink's a new use, though.
So is this.
It's a change of use. It's an existing structure that has a change of use in it.
It's an existing structure. It's a new use. If it weren't a new use, they wouldn't have to get a permit. You buy a new car. I just bought a new truck. I had a truck before. I still have a new truck, right? I changed trucks, but the new one's still new. The fact that it's changing, otherwise that provision would be, we can't read it out of the code. I'm sorry.
Well, I think reading it that way, you would, every time a business changed its use, you would have to meet the new standards.
Absolutely.
And I don't see that happening.
The code specifically says that you have to. It is a continuing obligation of the property owner to continue to comply with this code as long as they have a business. If you have a paved lot and you get a new use and your new use, the lot satisfies all the requirements, you're fine. But if the new use, if you don't have, this is a unique circumstance because it's recently annexed, but you have to pave the lot.
Well, that would just be onerous to every time there's a change of use to require somebody to go back and pave a non-conforming parking lot. And so that's
what the code requires.
That's why we don't do it.
I can give
code
an
requires
example. Besides the ice rink, I can give an example, but I don't think the point is to give examples. I think that it's more of a change of use, I think, more than a new use. But I think of another business that's opened right now that hasn't followed that same train of thought.
So, as Mark and Lorraine know, I've read judicial decisions probably 1,000 times more than anybody else. There's no way a court looks at that language and doesn't say, yeah, this is a new use, you have to comply with it. It just, there's no other reading. It's plain. It's really plain.
But it doesn't say the entire parking lot, does it?
No, it just has to be big enough to satisfy the requirements of the code.
So then my argument for that then would be that they've inherited an existing what is being used as an
Yes.
existing parking
Thank you.
lot, but it's far bigger than it would need to be.
Absolutely.
Even if it was a brand new building. So I
No, I'm not suggesting they have to pave the whole thing. They just have to pave whatever is necessary to meet the whatever daycare facilities.
But weren't
have
they
to have.
planning to do that anyway? I guess that was my point. I thought they were planning to do the ADA along with the sidewalk and the two drop-off spots, right?
The ADA space is required by law to be paved anyway, so that's already on an existing slab.
And those all correct. Mike hit it on the head. All three of those stalls on the southwest of that property, or on the face of that building, there is a current asphalt paved area.
Because it has to comply with ADA in terms of slopes
Correct.
and slip, all that stuff. And so, Ryan, do you know what the required parking number is for this building?
So for daycare facilities, it's required one parking stall per staff member.
I see
So-
1.25.
Correct. So the overall required parking would be for a total of 6 stalls, then plus the 2 loading areas, plus 1 ADA.
I mean, I know that building really well. My program goes out there all the time, or used to go out there all the time, the Shireman's, and it's a great space for this type of use. But the code says it has to be paved. That's what it says.
But only the number
Yes.
that it needs to
Yeah.
have paved.
And
not
however,
that entire.
and whatever access is required. Yeah, the required lot, that has to be paved. And they have 5 years. I mean, if we want to give them 5 years to do it. Of course, we've seen how that works.
You're reading my mind. They come back in 5 years.
Do we have to?
Did you have more?
That was it. I was
We
waiting for more
hijacked
questions
your
coming my way.
presentation.
It's throughout. This provision starts, the provision and maintenance of off-street parking and loading spaces is a continuing obligation of the property owner. Everything about this section of the code says you have to comply with this. You have to pave it, and you have to maintain it. You have to ensure that it's appropriate if the use changes. If you add to the structure, everything about it says you need to pave this and keep it up to. That's what it says.
Well, it's a continuing obligation if you're required to pave it in the beginning.
Which they are.
Which they weren't, right? It's non-conforming. It was in the county, it was annexed into the city.
Well, but we have to understand, it's not a non-conforming, we're not talking about the non-conforming structure, and we're not talking about a non-conforming use. This is a flat piece of land that they happen to throw some gravel on. It's not a structure. And the fact is and the law protects non-conforming structures, I understand that. But the code says a new use must comply. And you can't, it's just English. It's a new use. Like, that's what new, my wife teased me when I walked out the door if I was going to need the dictionary this time. And I said, well, only if we disagree on the meaning of the word new, which I guess we are. But it is a new use. It's clearly a new use. It's not a continuation of the existing use. There's no way around
there's
it.
a provision for a change of use, and that's what we go off of.
It's because you're reading it wrong. I don't know how to say that. The change of use says if a change of use results in need for more parking spaces, then they have to expand their parking lot.
No,
But that's assuming, yes, that's exactly.
Those spaces have to be in accordance with the provisions of this section. So we don't retroactively go back and make up the difference for what they don't have. It's just whatever the increase is, they would have to come back and make those up.
Wait, but that's assuming they have a lot. I don't understand that reason. That doesn't make sense. So a change in use, if it requires additional spaces, you have to require the additional spaces, and those spaces have to be in conformance with the code.
Correct.
That's what that provision says.
Yep.
That's not, and that's accepting that the change is a new use. You can't change to a pre-existing use. That doesn't make any sense.
So if the change doesn't result in an increase above what was already required when you have a non-conforming parking lot, then they're not required to bring it into conformance.
Yes, but that code provision doesn't say that.
Under change of use, it does.
No, it doesn't.
Well, that's been our historical interpretation of this. You know, I mean, nowhere in town do you have a change of use and all of a sudden you're required to come up to retroactively come back and come up to all the new standards in town. So, you know, you're certainly welcome to interpret that a different way, but that's not
what
the
the
way
code tells you you're supposed to be doing, Mike.
We've actually had conditions where we've had to add parking. Because the use changed, and so the parking ratios change, and so they have to be in compliance. But what seems awkward about this conversation to me is that this particular use, whether you call it new or a change, is a change. It's a change, whether we call it new or old, it's a change, and it has a different parking ratio attached to it, and this new or changed use has a lower parking ratio attached to it. So if we disregard that entire picture there of how big that space is, as I understand this code, they have to have 6 stalls paved. Right?
Yeah, that's all I'm saying.
You don't think they do? Or they don't?
No, it's a non-conforming parking lot, and it's a change of use that doesn't increase. So what they were required to have before would have been somewhere around 15 spaces. So they have existing gravel spaces in that parking lot. So they don't exceed the 15 because they only required to have 6. So why can't they use the existing 6 spaces that are in the parking lot? And this doesn't require us to change and pave the whole thing. I mean, that's always been the historical interpretation of my department long before I got here. I mean, that's why you still have gravel parking lots in the city of Moscow that aren't required to be paved, that have gone back through changes of uses and changes of uses. If we were required, so take Rosar's parking lot, right? You know, obviously there's changes of uses in there once they expand. Huckleberries, we don't make them go back and all of a sudden put in all the required landscape buffers all the way around it. That's why we have all kinds of non-conforming parking lots in town that don't meet our landscape requirements. You know, if this was the case, every parking lot would look like a brand new parking lot.
So, is there a daycare center in this building as we speak right now?
No.
No, there's not, right?
No.
So I don't understand how the daycare center we'll put in there is not a new use.
Jerry, I'm just going to give you an example. We just had a new business change hands from Stookies to Hunga Dunga. And Hunga Dunga is a new business.
Yes.
It's new. It's a new business. It's not a change. It's a new business, and yet they don't have a paid parking lot.
Because Mike just explained that we have not been enforcing the code, and I don't care about that. The code says a new use requires compliance with the parking. That's what it says. I don't know. And our job is to take these words and enforce them. It's not to say, yeah, well, maybe, I don't know, some people shouldn't have to do it and some people should. And that is completely arbitrary. This phrase would be completely meaningless otherwise. I mean, at the time a new structure is erected or a new use established, off-street parking shall be provided in accordance with the provisions of this section. A person came to us requesting to use this building in a new way. It is a new use.
So why would you even have a subsection that says change of use then?
Okay, let's.
I have a thought here.
That
I'm looking at-
provision only applies if the new use increases the requirements. And it says if it does, then you have to make sure those increased requirements also comply with the code. You can read both and have them both make sense the way I'm reading them.
If it's
The
a
way
new
you're
use-
reading it, you're ignoring the first one.
If it's a new use, you're saying that they all have to meet the requirements anyway. So
Yeah.
why would they say if it's in excess, you got to meet them when you have to meet them anyway? There would be no reason why you'd have that subsection in there if they didn't want to draw a distinction between a change of use and a new use or structure.
How can you change to something and not have the next use be new?
It's a change of use. That's the typical building department term, zoning term. We don't issue a new use. It's a change of use permit through our department.
So what is this permit then? I mean,
Be a
is there
change of use from a neighborhood community center to a daycare.
which is not,
So is your issue criteria 6?
it doesn't comply with all the development standards of the code.
Well, as I read the application here, what we are looking at is a conditional use permit for a large daycare facility as opposed to a small daycare facility, and this NB, neighboring district NB zoning, allows for small daycare facilities. And this particular request is for a large daycare facility, which is 21 children or more. So it doesn't deal with the parking lot issue from the standpoint of how many whether it's paved or not, or how many parking spots they have. It's as you probably realize, that people come and go with the daycare, and they aren't staying there for any length of time.
Yeah, but the parking is based on the number of workers.
Right.
So
I
if we have a
realize
bigger
that.
daycare, then there probably have to, between a small daycare and a large daycare is probably one stall. Unless
And
it
they would
becomes
still be
really-
required to meet the applicable development standards of the
Yeah,
code. That
and
doesn't
I don't
change.
mind. I think that's probably relevant, but getting to a point of paving the whole parking lot would be pretty astronomical. But adding a couple of spots to get to the 4 plus 4 1/4 or 4.1,
which is what I thought we were.
The whole thing doesn't have to be paved.
Right.
It's not a parking lot. It's a flat piece of ground that has some gravel on it. It's not a parking lot under any definition of the code. It's not a parking lot. So they have to create a parking lot.
During the initial application process, the applicant has indicated that because it's such a large parking lot, they're actually looking at reducing the overall footprint of that, with the realization that they can utilize more green space for the children.
Which would be great, I think, actually. Yeah, I mean, I totally support that. I'm not suggesting in any way that entire thing has to be paved. That's not even remotely what I'm saying. But whatever the code requires for parking, the code says, our presentation said they have to comply with the parking requirements, which includes paving it.
Well, I have some thoughts and comments on criteria 6, but what I'd like to do is hold off that.
Well, that's the one I'm talking about, right?
Well, your presentation is over. I'd like to open up for the public aspect of this. Let everybody out
Oh,
here
I'm sorry.
speak.
I went way ahead.
Then we'll listen to what they have to say, close it, and then we'll argue some more.
Joe, you can always tell me to shut up until the applicant gets to talk.
So
You're probably
that
better.
said, I would like to open up the public hearing, and if the applicant would like to come up, state your name and address for the record, and tell us about your application.
Okay, so I'm Kayla Stuckey, 1028 Granford Drive. I am proposing I'm actually going to be taking over Grandma Beach Child Care Center and Preschool is the actual legal name of the business. And it currently resides on C Street over where it's been for 30-some years. It is currently considered a large daycare in a residential area because the owner lives upstairs. And due to the fact that I am not going to move my family into the upstairs of the daycare, and I have to move it per zoning requirement because there is not off-street parking. So that is the purpose of moving the facility, because it currently resides in a basement of a home. Second is I have 2 master's degrees in education. I have an early elementary education, and I am looking to expand this daycare. So the 4 parking spots, you might as well just forget about that, because this daycare is going to grow like this real quick, because it's being churned and converted into a full-fledged preschool. For early intervention, to include inclusion, so special needs, gifted and talented, and your average student. According to my conditional use permit, it was 4 full-time employees plus 2 to 4 part-time employees. That did not include myself. So the 4 parking spots is not realistic because it's 1.25 parking spots per employee, which means for the 4 full-time I would need 5 parking spots. For the 4 part-time I would need 5 parking spots, including myself, which would make it 12 because I would be the 0.25 over. So there's 12 parking spots that are actually required per my conditional use at this point in time. The loading and unloading zone would also be more than 2 stalls, even though that is the required, because the average drop-off for parents is between 7 and 7:30. So I don't just have 2 parents dropping off at one time. So I did take that into account, hence the roundabout option on that. The parking lot is much shorter in the original drawing, but I didn't have a beautiful program like Ryan had to make all these fancy colors, so that's why it looks the way it looks. But it was under my understanding through zoning and the engineering department that I would not be required to pave it, and this was prior to going into the even paying for the conditional use permit for the first 5 years. I was told I had 5 years to bring the parking lot up to code. Hence why you guys are debating that now. But I'm just saying that's what I was told by, I believe it was Bob at the engineering department. So that's my overall plans for it. I do plan on providing play structures. The other thing that was indicated in there is, which I know from past experience with you guys on that roundabout, on the, what would that be, east side of the roundabout, there will be a concrete sidewalk. So kids will be unloaded from the right side of the car to have a sidewalk to not be in the parking lot. And there will also be a fenced, we're putting in a split rail fence between the sidewalk and the parking lot to keep a barrier from kids running into the parking lot. So that is one of the requirements per the city for that. As for daycares, yes, you pay an arm a leg to send your kid there, but no, they don't make a lot of money due to the City of Moscow's staff to student ratio. So putting the burden on paving a parking lot with the other requirements such as a new fire system, the fencing, the landscaping of a paved parking lot, I just want you guys to take into consideration that aspect, the financial aspects of that for somebody who can't stay where they are just because of zoning reasons. And so I have looked, and this is the kind of the last resort place actually for this daycare before it closes. It currently houses 33 students right now. It has 33 students enrolled with the facility. The facility will allow me to house 67 students eventually as I grow. Any questions?
I have one.
Go.
So was it part of your business plan to pave at the end of 5 years?
It was not originally because I didn't think you had to pave, and the reason I will say that is because I am the Stookies, and I lived at Stookies Feed when Hunga Dunga went in, and they were not required to do it. And then per zonings, when I built my business plan, I had been in contact with Ryan, and so it was after the business plan that was already built that I find out the 5 year mark. So that was something I was going to plan for at the end of the 5 years at this point. But originally, when it was all started, no, it was not in the plan at all, except for to put the parking lots that were in there.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to clarify that Hunga Dunga is required to pave the lot. They have a 5-year development agreement to pave it. So there is no waiving of any parking lot requirements there. It was formerly Stukey's Feed, and now it's a brewery, so obviously there's an increase in a parking requirement there. That's why they're required to pave it.
Right. And they were required to just put bumpers in to designate the parking spots for now. And they've been given the 5-year extensions as long as they had a walkway to and from the brewery from multiple accesses from the business.
Any other questions for Kayla?
Pretty simple. That's what I want.
I have a question.
Yep.
Do you have, I know that in the application there was planned, or there was talk about doing some landscaping around the play area, the designated play area.
Yeah, so the landscaping around the designated play area, and that's all going to be contingent on how I do the parking lot. But where it says required landscaping was what I was going to do at first. Like, that's a must-have through the city. And then the landscaping around the play area is going to depend on my play structures. I have a couple play structures in mind. There will be a garden, a fenced-off garden area that will include that. But as far as my understanding is, I'm not required to put landscaping of any sort except for a barrier between like a fence to keep the kids inside of a play area so they can't run into the farmer's field and run into the parking lot. But as for plants and stuff, according to city code, I'm only required to do that against the Shireman's residential property.
But you did plan to do a fenced area for the...
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's going to be a split rail. And then we'll have either hog wire or some type of wire in between two split rails to keep kids from running. So yes, I do plan on that. And that's per daycare code. That's not per zoning code. That is a requirement by the daycare. So the daycare requirement code is requiring me to put a fire system in and the fenced area. That is part of the daycare license that will come.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anybody care to get up and speak in favor of this application?
Mr. Chair. Oh, sorry. All right, thanks. Just for the record, I did receive correspondence after the application and the packets were submitted. This is a letter from Mary and Terry Shireman at 3151 Robinson Park Road in Moscow, and they state, "We would like to express our support for the conditional use permit being requested by Kayla Stukey, Grandma B's, for a large daycare facility for the following reasons. The east side of Moscow continues to grow, and there is a need for high-quality daycare in this area. Number 2, the children would have a large outdoor play space as well as being within a short walking distance to Milburn Arthur Park. We believe that having room for our play outdoors and nature are essential to a child's well-being. Number 3, our home is the only residence adjacent to the daycare, so noise is not an issue. It's great to hear kids and adults playing and having fun. Number 4, family and small daycares are already an approved use for the neighborhood business. The move to approving a large daycare should not be an issue considering the size of the facility and the property. We have been hoping to find the ideal tenant neighbors since we closed our event center at the end of 2016. We believe that Kayla Stukey and Grandma B's daycare would be the perfect fit." Then they go on to say, as we are reading through the CUP information pack, we notice a small error. Please note under input from other departments, it states the applicant is on city water and shares septic to the adjoining property. We would like to clarify that the business is on city water, but the house and business are on 2 separate septic systems, and the business septic system was bumped and inspected earlier this month.
Thank you. Sir? Take your time. State your name and address for us, for the record.
Timothy Johnston, 207 South Washington, here in Moscow, Idaho. I just kind of think that, like everybody said, it's a great project and a great use for the space. And I mean, the semantics of 4 or 7 parking spaces or 12 parking spaces. It just seems like something we can figure out. And if that's 5 years down the road, that seems like the most feasible way to make it happen for the owner of the business. And I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want something like this in your community. That's about it.
Thank you. Would anybody else care to speak in favor of this application? Seeing a much smaller audience, would anybody care to speak against this? That said, we'll close the public hearing and open it up for discussion amongst ourselves. Here's my thought about criteria 6.
Okay.
I think it should read like this. The proposed use meets all applicable development standards of the zoning code as enforced by the city of Moscow. That doesn't say that it doesn't comply. It just puts the monkey on their back to enforce what compliance they want, and we should tag on within that 5-year period.
So here's the thing. If you don't read the 3A the way I'm reading it, none of the parking requirements apply, because that's the provision that applies them. If you can find any other place in this code where it says that these parking provisions would apply to this use, I'm happy to read it, but it isn't there. This is the one that says they apply. You have to have a provision that says we have these parking standards and they apply to this sort of activity. And the activities they apply to are new structures and new uses. There's no other place in there. And so either we say they apply, which of course Ryan's presentation did say, and we know that they apply, or we say that they don't and we can't require anything. And we know that that's not what the code requires or what we're allowed to do. And I'm not at all I think it's a great idea, but it really bugs me that we have a clear statement in the code that we're just ignoring.
Jerry, I think if B wasn't there, it would be crystal clear. If that section B wasn't there, but they muddy the waters when they use the term change in use. And I see what you're saying, because a change in use, by definition, is a new use. And you can make that argument. And
well, then point out where the code applies the parking structure, the parking requirements to this or any similar use.
Oh, I'm not saying you're wrong.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just saying that you've got these two. You've got a change in use, and the city is distinguishing a new use from a change in use.
Yeah, I don't think so. So the way I read it,
that's what I understood. Michael.
Yeah, that's it. Well, think about this, right? So North Main Street, you have a piece of property that's in the motor business zone, maybe a block north of Central Business. It's built all the way out to the property lines. There is no parking on site. A new use goes in there, so they're required to destroy a portion of that building and construct an entire new parking lot just to meet what the parking would be for that new use that goes in there.
That's a non-conforming structure, and
it wouldn't matter. It's a new use that goes in. It's a change of use that would have gone into that building. So you're saying that they would have been required to conform to all the parking requirements here.
Potentially. But then that argument suggests that we don't have any idea when the parking requirements apply. Just we make it up.
No.
So the way we have A says when they apply, and then B, C, D, E, and F. Mostly B, C, D, and E are subsets of that, and sort of different little precise sort of unique circumstances where we wanted to provide some additional information. So alterations being one. Other parking areas, and I think the other parking areas even proves the point more. If you go above and beyond what is required and add parking that you're not required to add, you know what you have to do? You have to pave it. You have to comply with all of the provisions of this section, even if it's not required parking.
Well, and I see what you're saying, because, A essentially renders B superfluous. Because what you're saying, if a change in use, if that's a new use, then we don't even need B, right? Because B talks about a change of use increasing. We know that.
But not necessarily. That it increases?
Well, B talks about a change of use, and it talks about if it increases the requirement for parking spaces, then they have to comply. But I can see that if a change of use is a new use, which means they have to
comply with the code.
Comply. So that, I mean, the part I'm troubled with is it seems like if you read it that way, then B is superfluous, because anytime that there's
well, then what is a new use?
Well, and what's a change in use? And they throw out this term, but they don't necessarily define it.
I think that the change in use provision is intended to apply when you have an existing lot, and a person expands the use slightly, and it's clear that even though you have an existing complying lot,
but you're still going to
have to add.
But they talk about an expansion down there in C. Yeah, down in C, they talk about that, and so that's
an expansion or enlargement of an existing use. See, it's when a structure is enlarged or the use within a structure is expanded. That's not a change in use, and that's not a new use.
But where did they define the change of use? So that's the
change in use, though, if I understand this correctly, is not that it's a new person or a new business in it, but the type of use that's happening within that structure, correct?
Has
Whether
changed.
it's a Class B or a Class M.
Proposed
or a
to change.
Right.
Do they define these terms anywhere in the code, or do we just?
Yeah.
Well, it's self-explanatory. Change of use is allowed use in the zone, and it changes to another use that's allowed in the zone, whether it be conditionally or permitted.
But if you have to read all of these...
How do you distinguish that from a new use? So, and I think that's part of what Jerry's saying, is how you...
Well, you have 3A. 3A is the catch-all. This is what it applies to. This code, there's parking requirements apply to new structures and new uses. Right? That's what that provision is for. That is the one that applies it. Otherwise, it doesn't apply. And you can read, if you take that out, if you ignore A and ignore that interpretation, then none of the rest of it applies any parking requirements to new uses or to any use. And then B is when the change increases the parking requirements. We want to make sure you know that change in use, that the increase in parking requirement has to comply with the code. The expansion or enlargement, if you have an existing use and you do something that increases the parking demands, you still have to comply with the code. Other parking areas, if you go beyond what you need to do, you have to comply with the code. If you change it, it has to comply with the code, right? So it's a general application of the code to all new uses, and then a series of more specific applications to precise instances that, for whatever reason, they decided they wanted to point out specifically. But if you go back and you just think about it in this way, if this is not a new use, none of the parking requirements apply.
So you're saying that B, C, and the following are subordinate to A?
Yes, absolutely.
They should be a subset of
I agree with that,
It
too.
would be a subset of A.
Yeah, but this code is not the code is not written that way.
Yeah, it's not structured. Doesn't look like it's
Yeah,
structured.
I mean, throughout the whole code is not written that way. But, and they don't, that's not the way laws are necessarily written. You have, ideally it would work that way, but you have distinct requirements and even subsets through, I mean, I can probably come up with hundreds of examples if I really felt like it. But this, 3A, is where it says what the code applies to. And nowhere else does it say what the code applies to. And so if you don't read 3A to capture all new uses, conditional uses, permitted uses, anything, then the code doesn't apply to them. And we would have to say either, I mean, honestly, if you don't read it the way I read it, then that parking stuff, we can't require it. Because there's no provision of the code that says we can require it unless you read new use to capture this use. There's nothing there. I mean, there's literally nothing there. Because the way you're reading change of use, if it's a change of use, then none of these apply because they don't have additional parking requirements, so nothing applies.
Correct. There's still
Not even the numbers or any of it.
Yeah, they do. Look, if you go further on in the chapter, subsection 7, says each off-street parking space shall be designed to conform with the city parking lot standards as set forth in Figure 1. So that's all the dimensional standards. They need to meet travel aisles. They just don't need to meet the design requirements for parking lots, which require it to be paved.
Off-street parking shall be provided in accordance with the provisions of this section. So are you reading that as section, well, that's section 6.5, that's the whole thing. Right, 3A
No.
says this entire section applies to these things.
I'm at 6.5.
I know, but
7.
6.5 is the section, right?
6.5.7.
Yeah. No, I understand where, but if the off-street, if this code provision does not apply to an activity, then it's not off-street parking. Off-street parking isn't even required. Right? If it's not a new use, there is no off-street parking required.
It's a change of use. So there's off-street. There's already off-street parking provided in the existing parking lot. It just has to meet all the dimensional standards. So that gravel parking lot meets all the dimensional standards for the spaces that they're required to have. It's certainly large enough to meet 15 spaces that would normally be required, and so they're not required to, since it's not in excess of 15, they're not required to provide any additional. So the interpretation has always been thinking about that property on North Main. A new use goes in there, you're not required to tear down half the building and construct a parking lot in the back of it, which would, was what you're saying would imply. If you have a change of use,
structures have separate legal protection.
if you have a change of use and the requirement increases, so say you're required to have 5, Jim comes in, you're required to have 7 all of a sudden. You need to provide whatever is in excess, and it needs to meet the parking requirements. So you have to tear down a corner of the building and provide 2 parking spaces on that property. But you don't retroactively have to go back and create the 7 that you would normally be. It's the excess, and that's how it's historically been interpreted in our department. I mean, that would pretty much preclude any type of new use to go in any existing building that doesn't conform to the parking lot requirements in town. It just would be unrealistic.
So what's a new use?
It'd be a new use on a new structure. Everybody knows what a new structure is. New use could be a use that isn't associated with a structure.
Yep.
And that's why they say new structure or new use.
That doesn't make any sense. Is this a use that we're talking about?
It's a change of use.
Is it a use? Is
course
it a
it's a-
use of property?
Sure.
It's a conditional use permit, right? It is a use.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying it's not a new use? Again.
I'm saying it's a change of use because that's a provision underneath the off-street parking and loading requirements.
Nothing applies the code to this use. There's no section of the code that says the parking requirements would apply.
Where does the 5 years come in? I'm going to jump in here. Where does the 5 years come in?
The 5 years is when you're required to construct a parking lot. Under subsection 6 here, it says that you're able to defer the parking or the paving of the parking lot for 5 years through a development agreement.
Okay.
All other requirements are required to be installed: landscaping, curbing, wheel stops, all that's required.
So
it's just that the paving of the parking lot's allowed to be deferred for 5 years through that development
So
agreement.
that gives us 5 years to to defer. You're saying she needs to provide parking because it's a new use. Kayla's clearly stated that her business in the next 5 years is going to grow and change. So to try and define how many of those stalls need to be paved is kind of pointless to me at this point. So I go back to what I stated before. I think we should add as enforced now and size determined by the city within that 5-year limitation. Because in 2 years from now or 3 years from now, she's going to have a better grasp on how many stalls she really needs. And at that point, the city can interpret their requirements for her within that time frame.
So the problem with that, if we approve anything right now and she hires another person, That's an expansion or enlargement, and she'd be required to pave those new parking lot spaces.
But she'd have up to 5 years to do it.
Maybe. See, that's why it's. If you don't call this a new use, I don't know how to. I've said this now 5 times or something. There's nothing that applies any of this to this application, and that's clearly not the intent. I mean, there's no way we're going to say, yeah, well, because there's an existing gravel lot, we don't care about any of the parking requirements. That doesn't make any sense. But there's no other part of the code that says the parking requirements would apply to her use unless it's a new use. Nothing else says that. I mean, you have thresholds. You guys know this. You have doors. You have things that the law says it applies to this and not to that. This is a classic example. It's a large daycare, so we have a threshold and says it needs a conditional use permit. Without that, we wouldn't even be here. You have that legal requirement that says this stuff applies to these things and doesn't apply to those things. And the things it says it applies to are new structures and new uses. And in the land use context, structures are the buildings and uses are what you do with them. I mean, it's completely clear. It's a use, it's new, it applies. Otherwise, we can't do anything.
Jerry, since you've got a hard copy of the code and I don't.
I'm happy to share it with you.
Yeah. Do you have the definitional section
No,
provisions in there? Because I was looking at the definition of use, and of course now I cannot find it. But maybe somebody, let's see. There's a whole definition section in here.
It's
Mike,
not
your
in there.
position,
it's not in that
the
part.
city's position wasn't that they didn't have to do any paving at all, was it?
Yeah. Our position is that it's a non-conforming parking lot, and they wouldn't be required to do any paving because it's not in excess. The change of use, it doesn't result in an increase in the parking requirement than what was already required as part of the neighborhood community center. It's the same scenario as having that North Main scenario we just went through. If they're required to have 15 with a neighborhood event center, and all of a sudden they're required to have 17, we would just require those 2 additional parking spaces to meet all city requirements.
Which 2 additional ones?
The ones in excess.
But you just said that they didn't have to pay.
No, he said if they did exceed to have 2 more, then they would.
Then they would kick in. But it doesn't exceed it. It's far less than what's already required as part of this.
Okay, so there's some existing stalls there now that are paved or concrete. They're asphalt or concrete.
Asphalt.
The new use or change isn't increasing that number at this point. So you're not requiring any additional paving. Is that correct?
No. Yeah, we're not requiring any additional paving, no.
Unless the volume of her business requires additional stalls be paved, right?
Unless it goes over what was originally required as part of the neighborhood event center use.
Okay, and what was that number of stalls? What was the event center's required number of stalls? Because until she exceeds that, then they don't need to pay.
No, that's not true.
Well, that and where Jerry's coming in on that is he's keying on the idea that this is a new use, and because it's a new use, then these development standards apply. So I see Jerry's argument.
Yeah, but why would they have change of use listed right
Well,
below that?
and that's my point. They throw out this term change of use, and they don't define. Because I can see Jerry's argument, which is any time you change your use, it's almost by definition a new use because it's not the same. So a change and the newness go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But the troubling thing about the code is
it's an existing structure.
Yeah,
That's not a structure. That is not a structure. The
Okay.
lot is not a structure.
So,
The building is a
The
structure.
building is a structure.
Yeah, but the lot is
Right.
not a structure.
And that's the use.
That's the use.
yeah,
No, it's not. What's the use?
the use is a parking lot. The use was a parking lot. I'm looking,
that's actually
and I'm looking right now at the definitions here.
Yeah, I see it. I have it too.
And so, And I was hoping there'd be a definition of new or new use or change of use, and there isn't any. But I'm thinking that new use refers to the initial use of land, a building, or a structure, and any subsequent use is a change of use.
So I can see that where if we're ignoring the building, we're talking about the parking lot, it's being used as the same.
Correct.
It's still being used as a parking lot, so therefore it's not a new use.
So now we're dividing one legal parcel into two separate parcels for the use purpose? I mean, the use of the parcel is a daycare.
I mean,
Well, the use of the parcel is a parcel with some open land that's a parking lot, and a structure and a building that was a community center, is now going to be a daycare center. But a given parcel can contain land and structures and buildings.
So this is the problem with not having.
And it says, and so it's the purpose it now serves, or for which it is occupied, maintained, arranged, designed, or intended. And the parking lot has been occupied as a parking lot, was maintained as a parking lot, was arranged with some stalls as a parking lot, and designed and I'm not sure about designed, but I think intended.
What is the purpose? What is the parcel used for? What is it intended to be used? What is proposed to be used for?
See, and I see what Jerry's saying. I mean, if we're able to bifurcate, then that works. I can see Jerry's point. The use is the overall, kind of that parking is ancillary to the what the whole property as a whole was used for. So I see Jerry's point.
We can't define the parking as its own use because the use of the building is what defines the number of stalls in the parking lot. And if the parking lot is its use in and of itself, there's no way to define how many stalls.
It's also not a permitted, potentially not even a permitted use within the zone, so we couldn't allow her to have a parking lot. If we're going to call it a use, then we don't have an application for a parking lot. So it's the daycare center. It's on.
Again, I still go back to my initial thought on that item number 6, in that the current new use doesn't require more stalls than what's already paved. I think that we should modify this so that the city enforces the requirement as the business grows, which is actually what C or D states anyway. And then it defers it basically for 5 years for the number of stalls to be determined and the city to enforce what it wants to enforce.
It's a practical solution.
That's practical.
And the other thing is, our whole discussion this whole time has been about the number of parking stalls and whether or not they're paved. It hasn't been about whether or not this is an applicable use for a daycare. And I don't think any of us disagree with the use of this as a large daycare, not a small daycare.
Yeah, I mean, it's because if it doesn't comply with development standards of the code, we can't approve it.
Right.
I mean, I don't object to any of the other issues at all. I know the building really well. I've been out there a bunch. I think it's a great location. The circulation design avoids issues with traffic on Robinson Park, I think.
We could always make a motion.
I was going to say, we can always make a we tend to like to argue so that we get unanimous decisions. We do not have to have a unanimous decision. I'm just going to point that out. We do not have to have a unanimous decision, even though there are 6 of us here, so it could be a split decision. But I would still entertain a motion from anybody, whether it's to reject it because of 6 or to include it because of 6 and modify our criteria.
Now, you don't have to agree with me, and you might vote this down, and I'm totally fine with that. But I move that we approve with the condition that the lot be paved within 5 years as required by the use at that time. Meaning whatever her size of her operation is.
Which is what I was saying. It defers it for 5 years, and it gives the city the 5 years to determine the use and number of stalls required to be paved at that point.
And 5 years at a time. Yeah. So
So what if we amend the code in the next month to clarify this issue you have with the change of use and the use? Would that absolve them from having to pave the parking lot?
If the way you said it is that when it's assessed in 5 years, that's what needs.
Well, I can change it. We're talking about a motion that should just die for lack of second. Then I can make a new one. Then we can talk about that one. You can say, actually, let it die. Let me amend it.
Don't hear a second, so that motion dies.
All right. So the motion is to approve the use, provided that within 5 years the parking lot is. We can fight over the verb, but the parking lot is improved to whatever standards are required by the code at that time for all parking lots. Right. The thing is, if the code changes, that doesn't affect us at all. We have to apply the code that's in place right now. I mean, we can't imagine that the code changes.
Yeah, but your condition, what I hear you saying is your condition kind of runs with the code. So if the code changes and that's obliterated, then
yeah, that's fine.
We're just saying whatever.
Yeah, that's what I always say.
Yeah.
We have to apply the code as written, and if City Council decides that they don't like it, then that's their job. That's not our job.
And they, in this instance, would have 5 years to change it.
They could change it.
Or address it.
I would second that.
Do you second that?
Well, I guess just a point for the record, I've got the off-street parking section going for public hearing at the end of April for planning and zoning, so I could certainly amend that to provide clarification as to our interpretation of the change of use.
That would be helpful. I don't think it changes our motion in a second because we're still looking for
I mean,
it to be
because my understanding is
enforced at that point in
right.
time.
It's if the code changes and this, let's just say the section is terminated, then we don't worry about it. But yeah, so I'm comfortable. I will second that.
All right. I have a motion. I have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. That was a unanimous.
See, you got
So Jerry, it's all in the presentation.
Ayes, 0 nays.
It's all in the presentation.
How are you, Ann, on what that said?
So are we going to do basically the same thing with regards to the relevant criteria? Again, mirroring what Jerry said, after the first one, is there any direction that you need from us on the other 6, other than criteria 6? The other 7, I don't think were even considered. The nuisance, the applicability,
I would agree. I think we're all
the code.
I think all evidence presented to us, because we heard from the only neighbor, indicates that it will not have any issues with surrounding land uses or nuisance. That's the evidence presented to us, so I'm fine with that. For 6, I think it does, right, we need to say the proposed use meets all applicable development standards in the zoning code, provided that within 5 years the applicant designs a parking lot consistent with the code requirements at that time.
Yeah.
Is that, with the intent, of course, that if it doesn't change, that it's paved.
or at least the spots that
The amount of
the amount that is
that's
required. No, I mean, that's the thing is, that's not a parking lot. That's
be.
a flat chunk of gravel, and we have to ignore it because she has to build a parking lot. And it can be whatever size and shape and design and whatever. It can be anything. It's not that space.
So is that a formal motion?
To do, yeah, that's fine. Did that make sense? So it was only to fill out 1 through 5 and 7 consistent with the evidence presented in the discussion by the board, with 6 to contain at least that language, that the applicant meets all applicable development standards in the code, provided that within 5 years the applicant paves a lot according to the use at that time and the relevant and the requirements of the code. Is that?
That's how I understood it.
Okay. That's how. So yeah, that's the. So I
hear a
move
second.
to do that.
Second.
I hear a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. That is unanimous as well. 6 ayes, 0 nays, 0 abstentions. That gets us through that one. Is there any new board communication?
How much time do we have to have a week to publicize it? 48 hours to publicize it. So next week sometime? And this would be just a 5 o'clock.
Correct.
We did 5. Have we done them at 5:30?
Needs to be 5:30.
5:30? Wednesday the 29th? Wednesday or Thursday? I don't think we can do Monday, can we?
What day? We can't do Monday unless we have a different location, right? Or can we even do it?
Is Monday soon enough? Is that not going to give us?
That's not going to be enough time to draft the criteria, so we'll have to look at maybe Tuesday or.
I know that Tuesday I'm going to be over in Pullman at a 5 o'clock appointment, but Wednesday is.
Wednesday's okay for me.
Of course, we don't have to have us all here either, so I
You only need 3 people.
Yeah.
You only need 3 of us.
I'm out Tuesday and Thursday and would prefer not Wednesday, but I can provide comments and you can ignore them if you want, then approve them. However, it's not that big a deal that I am here.
So far,
How about if,
I can do any of those.
Ann, how about you see how much time it will take you to prep that, and then send us an email, or have the city prepare that, and then give us 2 consecutive days next week that you know will be ready for it, and then we'll see which one of us we can get the most of us to.
Okay.
Because I honestly would like to look at my calendar. I think I'm open any one of those days, but if we can have the city give us 2.
Certainly.
I mean, just as a recommendation to the board, in cases like this where we have unanimous approval of it, I personally don't feel obligated to come. If it were contested and I wanted to fight over what the RCS said, then it might, but like I said, Wednesday is the only day I'm even potentially available, but I don't feel the need to be here.
And I'm available Wednesday.
I'm available Wednesday.
Wednesday, yeah, Wednesday works. Tuesday, any day next week.
Should we shoot for Wednesday the 29th, just so we have a date certain and then?
Mm-hmm.
Let's aim for Wednesday at 5:30.
That's enough time.
Okay. I'd like
that
to
all
hear
we
a
have?
move to adjourn.
So moved. Or
Have
second.
have a first, have a second, all in favor? Aye. We are adjourned.